Hello, and welcome to Video Lecture 1C, Ethics, Applied Ethics, and Organizational Ethics. In Video Lecture 1A, we distinguish between morality and ethics. Morality is that dimension of life in which we make judgments about the moral value of an action, a situation, or a person. We determine them to be good or bad, right or wrong, appropriate or inappropriate, etc. But such judgments need to be made according to some set of standards or norms. This is necessary in order for our moral judgments to be rational and defensible. If we think others should believe as we believe, should accept our judgments, then we need to justify them with reference to such standards and norms. The search for these moral standards, or more broadly, the search for a system by which we can determine whether or not actions, situations, and people are good, etc. This search is called ethics. Specifically, it's called normative ethics, as you saw in your reading for this week. Now, by the way, normative ethics is distinguished from meta-ethics, but we don't have to go into that, and I think most of you would probably prefer that we not go into that. But if you must know, just scroll back up to the beginning of this week's reading. Section 1 is all about metaphysics, and if you have some questions about it, just email me. I always have time to encourage students who want to learn on their own. Now, in Lecture 1B, we discussed the concept of morality a great deal. Now it's time to look at normative ethics. Your reading discusses three kinds of normative ethical theories: virtue theory, duty-based or deontological theories, and consequentialist theories. In this mini lecture, we will discuss virtue ethics. We will also discuss the most important and influential duty-based theory, that of Immanuel Kant, and the most important and influential consequentialist theory, which is utilitarianism. We will also discuss a fourth kind of theory that your reading does not mention, but which is becoming more and more influential, what is called the ethics of care. So let's turn to the first of these theories, which is known as deontology, which is obviously the noun form of deontological. And as we mentioned before, the most famous name associated with deontology is that of the 18th century Prussian philosopher Immanuel Kant, whom your reading discusses. Deontology comes from two Greek words which put together mean the study of duty. And duty is the central notion of deontology. Morality is a matter of duty, plain and simple. Our duties are what they are. Discussion ended. There are lots and lots of, so certain actions are either morally right or they're morally wrong. There are a lot of actions that are morally neutral, but those are not our focus here. So in deontology, context and consequences do not matter. If lying is ever wrong, and it is, then lying is always wrong. There's no such thing as a justified lie. You hear this view appealed to often. You've probably done it yourself from time to time. You are expressing deontology anytime you say something like, "I don't care why you took it. Stealing is wrong, and that's all there is to it." This view seems so obvious at times that it would be ridiculous to try to question it. But consider the following two examples. It's wrong to lie. But if you are protecting an abused woman from her crazy husband, and he comes to your house and asks if you know where she is, you're going to lie and feel fully justified in doing so. At least I hope you will. It's wrong to break a promise, yes. But suppose I promise to meet my wife no later than 8 o'clock. I'm on my way there and just enough time to make it by 8 when I see a child, obviously separated from his mother, hysterical with fear at being alone. If I stop to help the child, I will be late and will break my promise to my wife. But of course I'm going to stop and help. It would be wrong not to. So it seems that context and consequences do matter. And this is where utilitarianism comes in. Utilitarianism says that morality just is a matter of consequences. In any situation, the right thing to do is the alternative that is most likely to bring about the best results for everyone involved. By the way, your reading distinguishes between act utilitarianism and rule utilitarianism. If this were a class on ethical theory, we would spend time on that distinction. But it's not, so we won't. This intuitive understanding of utilitarianism here is fine for our purposes. Now, if you ask Kant if lying is wrong, he will say yes. If you ask a utilitarian the same question, she will say something like, well, that depends. And what it depends on is the exact context in which you are contemplating a lie and the results that telling that lie is likely to bring about. Utilitarianism is a very popular ethical theory. In fact, at levels of government, politics, and big business, it is the unquestioned understanding of right and wrong. So it's important that we take the time to give a few clarifications. First, in this description of utilitarianism, notice the words most likely to. We cannot simply say right actions are those that will bring about the best results. At the time we act, we cannot know for sure what consequences it will bring. All we can go on is our understanding of the situation and our past experiences. At best, this will give us a good estimation of the results, what's most likely to occur. But it is always possible that the consequences we predict will not come about. You cannot be held responsible for the consequences of an action if those consequences were totally unexpected. You had no reason to assume they would happen. So technically this view is, Second now, notice the words for everyone involved. Technically, this is only one way of thinking about utilitarianism. It's called universalistic utilitarianism or universal utilitarianism. It contrasts with egoistic utilitarianism, which defines right and wrong in terms of the balance of pleasure and pain for the person doing the acting. The question is, what's best for me, not what's best for everybody. This is similar to what your reading calls ethical egoism. But universal utilitarianism is by far the most popular version, and it is the one that is assumed unless you specify egoistic utilitarianism or some other type. So we will go with it. Third, what do we mean by the best results? What makes consequences good or bad? Well, again, different utilitarians have different answers to this question, but again, the most popular answer and the one that we will assume is that good and bad consequences are defined in terms of pleasure or pain. Pleasure is good, pain is bad. Your reading calls this view hedonistic utilitarianism. Of course, many situations are going to bring about pleasure for some people and pain for others. So the question becomes one of balance. The right action is the one most likely to bring about the greatest balance of pleasure over pain for everyone involved. Again, if this were a class on ethical theory, we would talk in some detail about how exactly we're supposed to measure this pleasure-pain balance. But again, it's not, so again, we won't. Now, this understanding of best utilitarianism, of best results, is called, as we said, hedonistic utilitarianism. And the word hedonistic comes from the Greek word meaning pleasure. So the particular brand of utilitarianism we are considering is universal hedonistic, it's hard to say, universal hedonistic utilitarianism. The view that the right action is the one that is most likely to bring about the best balance of pleasure over pain for everyone involved. This is the standard understanding of utilitarianism at work in the world today. Now finally, It's important to note that across the board, utilitarians are talking about the best results in the long run. Oftentimes, actions will bring about great pleasure in the present time, but lead to much more pain in the future. This is the key element behind what we call temptations. We are tempted by immediate reward to do something we know will hurt us or others in the long run. Krispy Kreme donuts come to mind. Utilitarianism does not advocate giving in to temptation. The focus is always on results in the long run. There's much more to be said about utilitarianism, but once again, this is not a class on ethical theory, so we need to move on. A theory from ancient times that has gotten a lot of attention and gained a lot of converts in recent years is virtue ethics. Virtue ethics holds that morality is a matter of character. The way to learn how to be moral is to watch good people and do what they do. So what makes an action right is that it is one that is produced by what philosophers call human virtues, characteristics we know to be beneficial and worthwhile, characteristics that we see in those good people we study. Examples of virtues include courage, kindness, trustworthiness, temperance, etc. We know these are good characteristics in people who have them generally do the right thing. So the key to ethical living is to develop the virtues in our own lives. And how do we do this? How can we become a virtuous person? Simple. Find a virtuous person and watch what she does. Find more than one. Start behaving the way people whose moral integrity you admire behave. If you start behaving like virtuous people behave, you will become more and more virtuous yourself. So the key to virtue ethics is mentoring. Learn from those who know how to do what you want to know how to do. Apprentice yourself to virtuous people. The one theory that your reading does not discuss is a new one that has come into prominence in ethical theory only in the last 2 or 3 decades. It's called the ethics of care. The ethics of care focuses on relationships. Right actions are those that properly respect the relationships you have with people. Though a new theory, this bears important resemblance to the ethical theory of the ancient Chinese philosopher Confucius. Again, no obligation to know that, but Confucian ethics is a fascinating study. Now, you have certain moral obligations to all people, to respect their human rights, to be courteous and helpful, etc. But you have even more or stronger obligations to those you consider friends. They have a right to expect you to be more responsive to them and their needs than you are to strangers. Even more so with family members, immediate family members, and one's significant other. The closer you are to a person, the greater your obligations to that person are, and the greater is the treatment that person has a right to expect from you. Your reading also deals with what is called applied ethics, which involves, obviously, the application of ethical principles to the special moral controversies we encounter in life. Applied ethics issues that have dominated public debate in recent decades include capital punishment, abortion, euthanasia, gay rights, animal rights, environmental issues, and many more. One critically important point that your reading makes is that applied ethics issues are controversial issues. Your text defines these as issues in which, quote, there are significant groups of people both for and against the issue at hand, end quote. Now, this is true, but does not go far enough. The reason significant groups disagree is because there are good reasons to be had on both sides of the issue, or however many sides the issue has. That is, In controversial moral issues, people disagree for good reasons. So it's not clear on the face of it what the correct ethical position is. There must be investigation, deliberation, and discussion. And even then there may be, may not be, likely will not be, unanimous agreement. Now, in video lecture 1A, we discussed what we called professional ethics, the study of moral obligations had by those practicing different professions, such as medicine, law, education, business, etc., to the people whom they serve and in whose interests they act. However, what we are calling organizational ethics is not yet a clearly identified field of professional ethics. A good bit of work has been done in this field, often called leadership ethics, but there is not yet a clearly defined understanding of what this does and does not include. The fully developed area of professional ethics that is most similar to organizational ethics is business ethics. A huge amount of work has been done in business ethics over the last 50 years, and particularly in the 21st century, since the collapse of Enron and Arthur Andersen and other companies in 2001. And a great deal of this work is directly applicable to organizations of all kinds, hence to organizational ethics. But there are some very important differences as well. So, it's key to distinguish between what we can learn from business ethics and what we should not confuse with organizational ethics. However, we've covered enough, so this will have to wait until week 3, actually. We first must return to the subject of morality, and specifically the issue of moral decision making. That is the subject of week 2. Sorry to cut you off in mid-concept development like that, but hey, it's like P.T. Barnum, the great pioneer of circus and sideshow, once said, always leave 'em wanting more.